Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to come to the first session of the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar this semester. And our esteemed presenter is Professor Herbert C. Kelman. And I actually was given by him a copy of his new book, which is called Transforming the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict from Mutual Negation to Reconciliation. And I was reading this book this summer and I thought, you know, we need to celebrate this because what it is, it's a compilation of many of his writings, certainly not all, or it would be an encyclopedia. But this book is really the essence of much of his insight, theory, and ideas about, in particular, conflict in general, but in particular about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so Susan and Hackley and I were trying to decide about who to invite to be our first speaker. And I said, I think we should invite Professor Kelman to discuss this book. And then it occurred to me that he had been doing this work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for almost 50 years. I mean, really close to an adult lifetime. So I think this is a celebration, and I'm so happy that all of you have come and taken the time to hear what he has to say about what it was like trying to be a peacemaker all those years. Professor Mnookin, hello. And so I first want to introduce him. I want to introduce him to you, and I also want to say that this session is being filmed, so if anybody has any objection to that, don't ask a question and the camera won't be focused on you. But certainly, I want you all during the Q&A to feel free to make comments or ask questions. But it will be filmed, and then Susan is going to be up on the PON website, or how will that?
Yeah, it takes a little time.
Takes a little time, but eventually it'll be on the PON website. And this seminar, the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar, is co-sponsored by the Program on Negotiation here at the law school, as well as the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. And this one in particular is also co-sponsored by the Middle East Seminar. So first, let me just say that Professor Kelman is the Richard Clark Cabot Professor of Social Ethics, Emeritus, here at Harvard University, and was the director of the Program on International Conflict Analysis and Resolution at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs from 1993 to 2003. He has been engaged for many years in the development of interactive problem solving, an unofficial third-party approach to the resolution of international and intercommunal conflicts, and its application especially in particular to the Arab-Israeli conflict with special emphasis on its Israeli-Palestinian component. He's the past president of the International Studies Association, the International Society of Political Psychology, the Inter-American Society of Psychology, and several other professional associations. He's the recipient of many awards, including the Social Psychological Prize of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and that was in 1956, the Kurt Lewin Memorial Award in 1973, the American Psychological Association's Award for Distinguished Contributions to Psychology in the Public Interest, and that was in 1981, the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order in 1997, and the Austrian Medal of Honor for Science and Art First Class, and that was in 1998. His major publications include International Behavior, a Social Psychological Analysis, A Time to Speak on Human Values and Social Research, and Crimes of Obedience Toward a Social Psychology of Authority and Responsibility, and that was co-edited or co-authored with Lee Hamilton. And Professor Kelman received his PhD in social psychology from Yale University in 1951. Well, as I pointed out, this event was inspired by this book, Transforming the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, and it's an extraordinary chronicle of the many contributions that Herb has made to the field of international conflict. And it's not just about international conflict, but conflict resolution and also its reconciliation. And I felt that he deserved an audience for this remarkable opus. And not only that, but an audience just to honor the commitment, the lifelong commitment that he has had for being a peacemaker. And actually, I mean, I think he's one of the moral giants in the field of conflict resolution. So one of the things that I thought about was what was so interesting about Herb that maybe some people don't really know is the fact that when you started thinking about the social psychology of international conflict, this was way back when power politics was the predominant theory in international relations and international conflict. It was, considered, realpolitik was considered, rational and functional given the anarchic structure of the international system. Of course, everybody's going to act in their own self-interest, and it's just a dog-eat-dog world out there. And so the realists were explaining conflict in these power terms. And Herb and very few others realized that the human condition is far more complex than that, far more complex. We're not all going around seeking power and resources and trying to outdo the other person. There's a dimension to humanity that needs to be explored, and he was one of the first, if not the first. I know he's so modest, he doesn't like being singled out as the anything, but the fact is you were. And wait a minute. So he's going to start going, I can feel it already. So, but Herb, what I wanted to ask you was, what was it about you as a person and you as an academic that realized that this social psychological dimension really needed to be part of the discourse on international conflict? And I know that it took courage for you, because I remember one time Herb telling me, well, there's a sea of realist sharks out there, and if I present myself in this soft psychology, he had to be, you were very concerned about legitimacy. Okay, go. So let us start with that. What was that like, bringing that dimension to the discourse?
Well, I should say, sorry if I'm, hope you can hear me. First of all, I should say I'm definitely not the first. I mean, there were people who were ahead just because they were older. I mean, several names come to mind immediately, like Gardner. Those names may not be known to most
Probably
of you.
not.
Gardner Murphy, Otto Kleinberg, Ralph White, who's sort of a little closer to my generation. So anyway, so there was a tradition of social psychologists kind of concerning themselves with issues of war and peace and international affairs and so on. And I was fortunate to kind of hook into that. I mean, that's really, in a way, why I went into the field. I decided to go into social psychology because I had been persuaded that that's the field that has a lot to say about issues of peace and justice and so on, and social change with which I was concerned. So that's why I went into the field. And there was certainly a history of it. And there were various important events. I mean, early, when I was still a junior in college, at Brooklyn College, where my mentor basically was Daniel Katz, he introduced me to SPICI, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, which had been concerned and had issued various kinds of manifestos and programs and so on, which was really trying to use social psychological concepts to work on a variety of social issues, including war and peace, and of course social justice and so on. So there, I'm not in that sense that much of a pioneer. I mean, I had footsteps that I had the privilege of following. But that's why, as I said in a previous interview, I was a social activist before I was a social psychologist. During my college years, I was in Brooklyn College in New York. I was active in peace and race relations groups. And as a matter of fact, it was during my college years, this was in the 43 to 47, that I accumulated a large part of my criminal record. I was, don't think it didn't matter. I mean, that, I worked for a while for the National Institute of Mental Health, and I was fired largely on the basis of my job was saved, but I was about to be fired. I participated back in, I can't remember now, 46 or 47, in what I guess you can call a stand-in compared to a sit-in. There was a group of people who went to Palisades Park in New Jersey, which is right across the bridge from New York, which, believe it or not, had a segregated swimming pool in the 1940s. That's New Jersey. And we went, and what we did was to stand on line, and, you know, a white person and a black person kind of, we got close to each other. And when the black person was refused a ticket, he would just stand there, or she, and then the white person behind him would stand there, and so on. And so eventually they called the police, and the police came with those wooden horses, and they pushed people away. And I was following, you know, the strict rules of passive, you know, Gandhian rules of passive resistance, which meant that I was not resisting, but I was also not cooperating. I kind of just stood stiff, and they eventually managed to push me into the police car, and I was arrested and charged with disorderly person, I think it was. And
so at what point then, Herb, after your activism and you were at Yale at graduate school, when did you decide that you were going to focus your attention on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, I mean, my attention had been on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since age 11. So I mean, this is part of my. I mean, I like to tell that story. So
please do.
So I'm going to tell it.
Great story.
But I mean, I should say that well, maybe people don't know. I mean, I was born in Vienna, and I was lucky enough to escape. You know, I'm Jewish, and we got out in time. But after the Anschluss, you know, after Austria was annexed to Nazi Germany, my sister, I had a sister who was 2 years older than I, and she was the leader in a lot of things. We persuaded our parents that we wanted to join a Zionist youth group. So recently, just a few years ago, my sister found an old diary that she kept during those months of 1930, that period in 1938. And in the diary, she tells a story that she came home one day after talking to a few boys who obviously belonged to a right-wing Zionist group, and who said that they have the answer to the Arab problem. And she reports that their answer to the Arab problem was, well, the Arabs have several countries in the region. We have only this one country. So let them move to these other countries and leave Palestine, which is what everybody called it. We knew about Palestine, but that's another story. And leave that to us. And she reports in her diary that at home, that idea was not well received at home, which speaks well for my parents. And then she adds, and Herbert would have none of it, because he said, you cannot make these people leave the land in which they have been settled for such a long period of time. So
11 years old.
So I was apparently aware of that obvious issue. So I go back to that time. What was the question you asked?
Well, that's the answer. I mean, I asked you at what point did you decide to focus your attention on the conflict in the
that's
Middle
the
East?
point when, but you know, when I made it my, you know, a large part of my professional and personal engagement, I guess, you know, I have to, you know, we had this little discussion when Donna was picking a title for this session. She wanted to call it 50 years of something or other, and I kept saying, but it started earlier, and so on. So she
lifetime.
But I didn't say a lifetime. I mean, I was thinking about, it started with the beginning of the peace research movement in which I was involved, et cetera, et cetera. But, so she went and outdid me and just said a lifetime, and that made me think even earlier. And so it reminded me of that experience when I was 11 years old. I guess a lot of people older than that haven't yet discovered that insight. So, you know, as I've said, went into the field because of an interest in issues of war and peace and social justice and so on. I was really sort of at the beginnings of the peace research movement in the United States. Peace research activities had started somewhere in Europe and Canada and so on. But when I was in graduate school, in my last year in graduate school, Arthur Gladstone, who was a fellow student a few years ahead of me, and I wrote a letter to the American, and by the way, both of us were conscientious objectors and were involved in peace movement. We wrote a letter to the American psychologists in which we argued that Gandhian theory and the theory of the theory underlying pacifism and so on is based on certain psychological and social science propositions. And wouldn't it be of interest for people, scholars in this field, to address some of these issues, to essentially test some of the hypotheses that Gandhi and his followers have been proposing. So we published that letter. That was, that was in 51. So this was McCarthy time, and we got some criticism for that. That seemed to be a little radical. But at the same time, we got a lot of positive responses from various people who said, why don't we do something about it? And so we arranged to have a meeting and formed a little group called the Research Exchange on the Prevention of War. This group was, published a bulletin, photo offset. I think it was a very advanced technique. But we did everything on our own. And we held symposia, and we had a summer workshop and so on. So that was really the beginnings of this interest. And then out of that, actually, eventually, and I don't want to go into all of the details about how it happened historically, but out of that evolved the Journal of Conflict Resolution, which started publishing in years get very confusing.
Doesn't matter. 60s, I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah, maybe a little earlier. Yeah, earlier, 57, I think. Anyway, and which then eventually, which was published at University of Michigan, eventually led to the Center for Research on Conflict Resolution and so on. So this was really the beginnings of the peace research movement in this country. I eventually became interested in trying to explore social psychological contributions, and that led to a volume published by SPSY, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, called International Behavior, a Social Psychological Analysis. And sort of the next step in my personal evolution was in 1966, I think it was, when I met John Burton, who was a senior Australian diplomat who had some disagreements with his government, and he quit. He was Director General of the Foreign Ministry of Australia, and he left and went into academia, and he developed an approach which he originally called controlled communication, but which I persuaded him apparently to change because I didn't like the word controlled. No, you have to do it more subtly. He came to Michigan when I was teaching there, and he had read my book, International Behavior, and I had read one of his books. So, and he invited me to come to London for an exercise, what we would now call a workshop, on the Cyprus conflict, which he was planning at the University of London. And I came to that and participated in it, and was immediately taken by the approach. I didn't like the term controlled communication, but he dropped it. Actually, it was in 1967, so a year later or so, when the 1967 war took place, that I got in touch with Burton and asked him if shouldn't we try to apply this approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he agreed, but the main problem, he even raised a little money for it, the main problem, which I soon discovered was a key to one of the important keys to effective work in this field, was that we weren't really sufficiently hooked into the relevant networks in the societies. And you can't just go in and do this without a lot of networking and with the ability to make use of these networks. And so nothing came of it. But I was very intrigued with the approach. I wrote an article about it. Then in 1970, is that right, Mary Jo? 1970, I was co-teaching a seminar with a young colleague here at Harvard named Steve Cohen. Steve, that seminar, by the way, had 6 students, one of whom is sitting right here, Mary Jo Good. Steve, I showed Steve the article that I'd written, and he became very enthusiastic about it. And he said, why don't we do a pilot workshop as part of the seminar? And I agreed. And we, both Steve and I, Steve was very engaged in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and as was I. And we both agreed not to deal, we called it the Arab-Israeli conflict at that time, not to deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict because we were too close to it to be able to be a relevant third party. But our students, we had 6 students, I think, in the course, persuaded us otherwise. And somehow we ended up deciding to have a workshop between Palestinians, Israelis, and Egyptians. We started organizing it. On the Egyptian side, we had a couple of very good candidates, and they came for a pre-workshop meeting. And I don't know that for a fact, but they dropped out right after this. I'm fairly certain that they dropped out because they decided this was going to be a no-win situation for them, because they were the leaders of the Arab world, the Arab League, and so on, and they had an agenda with Israelis. That became clear, when later literature revealed that there were sort of Egyptian interests at that time to enter into some kind of process with Israel. But I think they probably decided or were advised by the government. One of these people, by the way, became probably the leading Egyptian political scientist. And I think they probably decided that it was going to be a no-win situation because they had an agenda with the Israelis, but they couldn't act on it in the presence of the Palestinians because they were the leaders of the Arab world and they couldn't be breaking ranks. So I think that's why they decided to go. So it ended up being an Israeli-Palestinian workshop. So we had no, it wasn't in the course, but yeah, somebody in the course knew a Palestinian who was a student here, and who incidentally, he was a Palestinian living in Jordan, who later became the head of the Jordanian, not archives, whatever it is, doesn't matter. And he said, we were experiencing a difficult time in recruiting Palestinians because there was a taboo against meeting with Israelis. And he advised me, you go see, oh my God, his name will come back to me, but a Palestinian originally from Israel who was politically active, and I don't know if he was expelled or had to leave Israel, and came to New York, where he was working in the PLO. Rashid Hussein. He was a poet, and he translated Bialik, the Israeli national poet, into Arabic, for example. His Hebrew was perfect, and of course, so I got in touch with Rashid Hussein, and he said, well, come and see me and we'll talk about it. And he invited me to come to his apartment in New Jersey, somewhere, I forget, over the bridge. I remember going in the bus on the way through. Is it the Holland Tunnel or the Lincoln Tunnel? One of those tunnels. Anyway, they're all alike. And I was thinking as I was going in the bus, what am I doing here? I'm going to the house of that PLO man, and so I answered myself saying, that's my job. I've got to do it. So I came to the house, I rang the bell, and a woman opened the door, and she said, Herb Kelman. Anyway, the woman turned out to be a social psychologist, Jewish, who knew me through my activities, in SPICY, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. And she had gone on a trip to Israel that Jewish adolescents or young people are sent on. And she met Rashid Hussein, they fell in love, and they decided to get married. And so, I was more relaxed, and we sat down and I had a very, very good conversation with Rashid Hussein, and he said, fine, I'm going to come. And it so happened that he and his wife, and they had two visitors, and the visitor was also a well-known name, but I can't remember the name right now. Sorry, I didn't prepare for this. they were going to a party in a home of an Egyptian somewhere in New Jersey. And they said, "You want to come along?" And I said, "Okay." And so the five of us went into the elevator, and they started talking to each other, and they talked to each other in Hebrew. And I told them, "I just wanted to let you know I know Hebrew." So I didn't want them to say anything. You know, I didn't want to put them in an embarrassing situation. Why was that? Well, Rashid was married to an American Jewish woman who knew Hebrew but didn't know Arabic. And the other man was married to I don't know, somebody who didn't know English. So the only language the four of them had in common was Hebrew. So that was kind of an interesting experience. Anyway, we had that, this worked out all right. We had a workshop. And then, well, that was sort of the beginning. Then I went off to, Seattle for a year. And Steve Cohen did the course by himself, and he had a workshop, but this was on the India-Pakistan conflict. On my way home from Seattle, I had a heart attack in Montreal, right in the middle of giving a talk, giving a lecture, big lecture. I came back home, and I was kind of recovering when Steve Cohen came to visit me at the what's that place called? Over at the health services. Doesn't matter. Stillman.
Holyoke Center? No.
Stillman, is it called Stillman? Stillman Infirmary, yeah. And somehow in my conversation with Steve, I declared that, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the 73 war came on at that point. So the 73 war and my recovering from the heart attack was enough to say, I'm going to put this on top of my agenda. And so that's how it happened.
That's where it started.
Well, I mean, yeah, started a little earlier.
Well, I mean,
but
that commitment.
Yeah, that's when I committed. And it's been there.
And it's how many workshops later?
Quite
How
a
many?
few. But they, you know,
No, really,
they
how
aren't
many?
getting their act together,
Hundreds.
so what can you do?
Hundreds of
No,
workshops.
not hundreds.
You sure?
About 100.
Including all the classes and everything? In any case, quite a few. And, well, Herb, thank you for that. I especially, appreciated the story of when you were 11, because one of the things that is remarkable about Herb, those of you who know him know this to be true, that he has had a theme running through his commitment to ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the idea was that he felt, and he feels, correct me if I'm wrong, but that the way out of this conflict is if both parties engaged in a mutual recognition of each other's national narrative and of each other's humanity. And that runs through the whole book. In one form or the other, this keeps coming back. And I was struck by the fact that during, maybe in the middle, maybe after Oslo, perhaps, some of the participants came to Herb and said, Herb, we're hopeless. We're hopeless after Oslo broke down. We're feeling very hopeless, but we are asking you to please remain the repository of hope for us. Because without that sense of hope and possibility, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through this. And that was so touching to me. I wonder if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, it was long before Oslo. But I remember let's see now. That's the problem when you live a long time.
Too many things
The
conflict.
decades kind of merge into each other. But I know the experience you're talking about is that there were two independent cases, two very senior Palestinians, one in the private sphere, but very well connected, and one, within the PLO hierarchy. On separate occasions, I asked each of them whether, if they could come and participate in one of my workshops and so on. And they both said, no, we can't do it now. This was entirely independent, entirely independent. But both then added, but please don't stop. Please don't stop your work. My first reaction was one, well, if they don't want me to stop, why don't they help me? And then I said to myself, well, these people are doing what they have to do. I mean, they have their own, they have to decide when is the proper moment. I mean, it's a risky action for them, even though, the workshops are confidential and so on, but it doesn't matter. I mean, these things get out. It's risky, and they risk their political credibility and so on, and they have to decide for themselves what is the proper moment for me to take that risk. But what they were telling me was, essentially, they were telling me they considered what I'm doing important, and I felt that they sort of saw me as a repository of the sense of possibility, really. So as maintaining the sense of possibility, and that it made me feel that that is my function, and that's what I've tried to do.
And related to that, you called yourself a strategic optimist. And I'd like you to explain that, but it's really interesting because among the power politics, that whole environment, you felt that you had to not appear naive about looking at the fundamental human needs that were not being met in these conflicts and looking at that social psychological dimension. So you came up with this idea of strategic optimism.
It was
Explain
very,
that.
very spontaneous. I was giving a seminar at the Center for International Affairs, and it was sort of early in the days when I joined the center as a member of the core faculty, and I was giving a talk on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I guess, and at the end somebody asked me the question, are you optimistic or pessimistic? And my immediate internal reaction was, my God, this is really putting me on the spot. Here I am. I'm a new person in the shop. I'm sort of one of the most identified peaceniks in the faculty. I'm a psychologist, social psychologist, among political scientists and some economists and so on. And if I say, yes, I'm optimistic, that would immediately say, oh, well, that's what we expect. And it would sort of immediately undermine my position, which I hadn't yet established, really, in a sense. And so on the spur of the moment, I came up with the answer, I'm a strategic optimist. I guess figuring, if I add the word strategic, it couldn't be all bad in this setting. This is what the business is all about. Then I came home and I talked to Rose, my wife, and I began thinking about it, and I decided that that's really a good concept. I came up with it for strategic reasons, but it was a good concept. It differentiates between naive optimism and strategic optimism. A naive optimist says, oh, everything is working for the best in the best of all worlds. A strategic optimist recognizes all of the obstacles and says, okay, it's up to us to pursue all possible avenues for peace, to look at all the possible openings and to pursue them
Strategically.
strategically. I mean, you know, so basically that's how the term was born, and I think it's a pretty good.
I think it's great. Yeah. So the other, as I said, the other theme that ran through this book was that the only sense of hope and possibility that you felt or you feel for the conflict even now is this idea of the mutual recognition of each other's national identity, national narrative, and fundamentally their shared humanity. Could you say more about that?
Well, you know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is kind of has been, by and large, a zero-sum conflict around national identity and national existence. I mean, you have two groups who really have been denying the other's existence, the other's right to be a nation, and so I've come to the conclusion that this is a conflict in which, in a very significant way, reconciliation has to be moved up front. I mean, we usually think about reconciliation as a post-conflict process. You have a conflict and then you reconcile. But I'm arguing that you need reconciliation as an opening to negotiation. That, in other words, that you have to somehow find a way of saying, yes, we recognize your existence, your right to exist. We recognize your peoplehood. We don't, our narrative is not your narrative, but we recognize your narrative, and we recognize that you have authentic links to the land. And with this, and then we have to move on from there. So it's really engaging in a major act of mutual recognition, if you will, mutual recognition of the nationhood of the other and the links, the close links of the other to the land, to which we also have close links. So it's in a sense putting reconciliation up front in a way, rather than thinking about it as a post. Because we're never going to get to the post stage, I think, unless we can somehow mobilize that process. And I think it's not, I think it's possible. I mean, my experience, I mean, obviously, our workshops are not negotiations and so on, but under the right circumstances, there are moments in a workshop when there is this real kind of discovery, the readiness to see the other, to see the other in terms of to recognize their perspective.
Why is that so hard?
Well, because you see these as mutually, not just mutually exclusive, but mutually destructive. I mean, if this is your land, what happens to my rights?
It's the zero-sum part of it.
Yes, it's a zero-sum conflict in that, but it's a zero-sum conflict about national identity, really. That your identity, your very identity, is a threat to my identity. I mean, that's what it's about. And so one has to somehow overcome that. It's not easy to do. I mean, in a way, there have been leaders, I mean, like, I think Mandela, I don't know terribly much about him, but from what I know, is that he had this ability But anyway, the kind of work that third parties do or can do is perhaps a way of bringing that about.
Okay, we're going to get started again, and I have one last question that I'd like to ask Herb, and then we're going to open it up to you for comments and questions for the rest of the time until 6 o'clock. But when I was reading the last chapter of the book, which is on reconciliation, which to me is it's a very powerful summing up of pretty much Herb's entire life work. He did it beautifully, and he kept coming back to this theme of the need for mutual recognition, and he ended up with a very clear message, which I want him to elaborate on. And that message was that there is a certain type of leadership that's required to enable this principled peace and this mutual recognition. And Herb, I wonder if you would say something about, because you called there's a need for visionary leadership, a leadership that transcends the current narrative. Yes, transcends the current narratives, and more importantly than anything else, Herb said that what is really necessary, especially on the Israeli side, is a recognition that the power dynamics, the asymmetry of power that exists in the communities, that has to be recognized as an obstacle, the asymmetry of power. And this is when Herb started talking about the moral dimension of the need for recognition of each other's humanity and so on. So I'm just curious if you want to say, and then let me just say to balance this out on the Palestinian side, he argued that their strong suit was, they didn't have the power, but they had the moral power and the backing of the international community, in which they see themselves as the status as victims and people oppressed by the Zionist enterprise. And the leadership needs in that group, he said, is to transcend their understandable and justified victimhood and acknowledge that Israelis too have historic roots in the land and an attachments to it that must be addressed with a principled framework. So I would like you to say a little bit more about that visionary leadership and what you think the chances are of that happening.
Well, I mean, actually, I think I say.
I quoted you here. I read what you wrote. For the record.
Yeah, that in the absence of visionary leadership, which I think seems to be lacking.
Seems to be lacking.
At this stage, you have to rely on civil society, essentially, to provide that. And I guess that was just a kind of a form of advertising for my kind of work. That's I mean, a visionary leader. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Mandela and Gandhi, and I can't think of many more.
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King, definitely. Can embody this. But in the absence of such visionary leaders arising on the scene, you have to rely on civil society to provide that. And that was sort of, I mean, in a way, say that the various civil society activities that are going on, various kinds of efforts and so on, can perform the function that in other cases historically have been provided by visionary leadership. That was all. But I mean, a visionary leader is able to somehow communicate to the other that they understand the other, they respect the other, they consider that the other has certain rights, and so on and so forth. They're able to do that. And we just don't have that kind of leadership.
Well, you know what? It sounds like you're that visionary leader.
No,
I think you need to go there and.
Not at all. No, I'm not a leader. No, you have to be a leader.
No, I know.
Is part of the group.
Yeah.
You know, I mean.
But you have the vision. You may not have the leadership position, but I think anyone here would argue that you certainly have that vision. You just articulated the vision. And I think the one other thing that Herb has actually is he has the empathy. Because this is the first thing that goes, as we all know, first thing that goes in conflict is empathy. And here he was at 11 years old telling his 13-year-old sister that, no, we can't just throw the Arabs out of their homeland. This is their home. And that you are that empathic person. I mean, this is what you have that's extraordinary, and all of us who know you recognize that in you.
Can I ask you a question?
Okay. No, this is about you, not about me.
No. I was thinking about this.
Yeah.
About empathy and so on. And I've sort of noticed that in myself too. See, I'm being very modest. But I seem to recall, I don't follow the literature that empathy has been getting a bad reputation. No? Am I
No,
wrong
not
about
really.
that?
Not really.
Empathy is still an okay
I mean, there
thing?
was one Yale psychologist who argued that against empathy because he said that empathy isn't the only thing that's needed in order to, to do the right thing. He was making a moral argument. But the fact was, he was saying you should argue on principle instead of this need for an emotional connection with the other. But I think you do both. I think you are both emotionally connected to the Palestinian people, certainly emotionally connected to the Israeli people and the Jewish people, and you are arguing for a principled peace. So, okay, so you don't want to be a visionary leader, but you are a visionary. Let's leave it at that. He's a visionary. So thank you for everything that you've done, Herb. Thank you. All right, does anybody have a question? Okay, yes. And would you just say your name and introduce yourself?
My name is Christine. I want to thank you so much for your talk and all the service you've done. I'm quite struck with you mentioning Nelson Mandela and a visionary leader. I happen to have a friend who worked with Nelson Mandela when he was young. And I had studied that very much and had seen this is leading up to bloodshed and asked him, since you work so closely with Nelson Mandela as a youth, how did reconciliation become rooted? And he said, because we had a culture that respected our elders, because we all thought he was a crackpot. And we wanted bloodshed, and we didn't want to listen to a word he had to say. And he said, if we did not at that point, and I think it's broken down, had that respect for our elders, we did not see his vision, we would have walked away. And now he did it all over Africa, and he's doing it here in the US. So my question to you is this. I had never really thought of using truth and reconciliation in that manner. And I have a friend who spent a long time in the kibbutz and a Palestinian neighbor. And your way of going forward with this narrative and mutual understanding that doesn't lead to the annihilation of the other for success of the other side, there must be something in the narrative of each culture that could be that counterweight, that civil society that could start that. Because I'll just end with saying I'm struck by how entrenched it is. Your annihilation is my success, to the point where one of the women, and I'm so sorry, I forgot her name, she was in the concentration camp when she was a child, and she is famous for having forgiven Hitler, and they had smuggled her in to talk to the Palestinians who were the leaders about a possibility of talking, and she was completely unable to forgive or talk for all of the carnage she perceived on her side. So is there some kind of cultural weight that could be, that could really lead to a narrative on each side that would bring that empathy?
I don't know. I mean, it's a new idea, but I really can't offhand come up with an answer. But I have the feeling that there must be in the cultural resources of each side exemplars of that kind of, you know, it's a very nice challenge, but you know,
Think about it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right over here behind this woman, Diane, yeah.
My name is Philip Lynch. The Irish conflict, the Troubles, Northern Ireland and Ireland, seems to be getting resolved over time. I wonder if you could say a few words about that and the process by which it's been accomplished, whether it's been leadership or civil society. It's an easier problem than the Israeli-Palestinian one, clearly, but would have been thought to be almost unachievable 50 or 75 years ago.
I really don't know enough about it. You know, I was, I did end up chairing a, you know, an event. I don't know what to call it. That was run by another organization that brought together especially young diplomats and other sort of young leaders of conflicting societies for conversation and other kinds of joint experiences. And the person who was running these events was Jim Lowry, who was a former student of mine. And he had planned 2 such events in immediate succession, one on the Irish conflict, on the Northern Ireland conflict, and the other on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, both to be held in Dublin. And he had invited me to come for the Israeli-Palestinian one to be one of the resource people. Well, he got very sick, unfortunately, and he couldn't make it. And so he asked me to take over both events. And so I found myself kind of in charge of a event on the Northern Ireland conflict. And it was very, very, very instructive. But what was the question?
Well, I guess the question is, in view of your experience and all the academic work you've done, what would be your analysis of how that conflict was resolved?
Yeah. I guess this was an introduction to say that I'm not really very knowledgeable about it. I did have this one experience.
That was early on, too.
Huh?
That was early on.
Yeah. Quite some time ago.
You know, one of the things I think is really recognized as a key factor in the Good Friday Agreement, especially in 1998, was the fact that they had a very strong and well-trusted third party in Senator Mitchell. So I think that probably, I mean, you'll get different answers to that question, but I know that has been a significant factor in, according to them, and the parties anyway, that George Mitchell was really fair and a really strong broker in that conflict.
There would have to be some sort of willingness on both sides
Right.
to reach an agreement.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is just one factor, but I mean, that's why George Mitchell was asked to go all over. He was even asked to go into Israel-Palestine conflict, and that didn't work out so well. But right place at the right time, I guess. Yeah. Okay, and yes, right here. Yes, go ahead with the scarf.
Thank you very much, Professor. My name is Soledad. I'm from Colombia, and I'm a student at HKS. And before coming here, I was living in Gaza for 2 years, working for the International Red Cross. It was refreshing to hear you. I think that despite the 60 years plus of conflict, there is still some people that believe that there is a possibility. Now my question is regarding the narratives, recognizing narratives of each other. When you stand from Gaza, it's so difficult to imagine how is the world outside. And when someone is outside Gaza, it's very difficult to imagine how can be life inside, actually. So if we were like a new generation of peace negotiators or representatives of either side, and we wanted to start with some simple steps, because the leadership that we have nowadays is not very conducive. So what, if you were to say, if you were to help us guiding small steps, what would be that?
That's a tough challenge.
Well, what about the work, the interactive problem solving, those efforts, something like that, perhaps? Pam?
Supposing some really terrific group of people from both sides talk to each other in a workshop and it were televised all over the country, might that help? Sorry. Was I clear? Could you hear me?
Televised as it was going on?
Yes, sort of like what we did with the BBC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have to struggle with that because that goes so counter
I know.
to my whole approach.
But if it doesn't get out there, and people don't, if it doesn't get out there in public, the only counter, it seems to me, to terrible leaders is the public. So if the public doesn't get mobilized and see that people can go through a difficult and honest process with each other and get to another side and stumble along together, I don't know, but it's a thought.
I don't think I answered your question, but it's a tough
Well,
one.
I like Pam's answer. I think that was good.
May I just add that?
Sure.
You clearly have had an experience with that, but I remember that Nightline had a series of, remember Nightline?
Sure.
Those of you who
Ted Koppel.
have lived on this earth as long as some of us have. And it was very powerful. People like Hanan Ashrawi were speaking. We could probably go back and look at those tapes. And it does influence the public. These are extremely very knowledgeable people. I'd love to ask a question.
Oh, well, yeah, I'll put you in the line. So we have Everett, you're next, and then Everett, and then Lenore. Oh, we have another one? Okay, and then that up here, okay.
Hi, I'm Paula. I'm actually so glad to be here, Herb, to hear you. And there are 3 of us in this room that were part of a workshop book project on recognition as key for reconciliation on Israel, Palestine, and beyond, including Northern Ireland. And I actually just wanted to put one idea out there that ties, I think it was Christine first, and I don't remember your name, but I've been in Northern Ireland quite a bit, and and also Israel-Palestine. Those are my two areas. And when we met with George Mitchell in April on the 20th anniversary of the peace accord in this past year, one of the things that the senator said, I think that was very important, was the recognition of the women. And this also goes back to your comment about what is indigenous to each culture. And we have found, in response to something that Herb has brought up, that there is a lot going on in civil society right now in Northern Ireland, and most recently, thousands of women from Northern Ireland went to the South to help get the referendum passed in the Republic of Ireland. And they're fighting for their rights right now against Brexit. So, and it's really the women's leadership. They have no government right now in Northern Ireland, haven't had government since January 2016. And the women are running a lot of the councils. And they've, in fact, suggested to us Americans, you guys would do a lot better without government right now compared to that. So I just shared that with you. And let the civil society go. But there is something very, I want to say, cultural, social, psychological. We had Israeli Jewish women, the 4 women that led the campaign to get out of Lebanon a number of years ago. There are a lot of Palestinian women in Nabi Salah, in Budris, et cetera, that have led nonviolent campaigns and are doing that right now. And there's a lot of work going on with Women Waging Peace and other organizations that are crossing boundaries from what Herb would say is the civil society. And I wanted to bring those up because I think we're seeing this in our country right now, of women rising up today. A lot of women, I don't know whether you know, but women all over the United States today wore black and were holding up signs all over the country today in solidarity about what's going on in our Supreme Court. And what we're finding is that this is really a kind of global resistance because there is not the faith in the leadership on the top, and that has broken apart in so many places. So I just want to give recognition to the role in particular that women are playing on some of the points that have already been raised. And I know it's something that Herb himself has recognized and worked on, so thank you for that.
So Paula, why don't you just hand it to Everett, and then we'll collect these comments, and then we'll move over here. And then Herb, you can address them, okay? Oh, I'll help you, don't worry.
Yeah.
Okay, Everett.
Everett Mendelsohn. There's an interesting tension that I notice in some of our discussions, and that is the looking for inspired leadership, looking for leaders who have come through or come across some boundaries and are able to speak to broader questions. And yet when I look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the moment, the disconnect is very great. In Israeli society, the change that's occurred in the last 20 years has been that the social order, the civil order, whatever we want to call it, has moved consistently to the right. And they've either had leaders who have followed the movement to the right or have even pushed it forward. For the last decade and a half, really, since Oslo, on the Palestinian side, particularly in the West Bank, Gaza's more complex, but the Palestinian Authority and the population largely have moved away from the use of violent confrontation and moved away from the notion that a violent movement will recapture our rights in Palestine to something which has been clearly and explicitly led down a path of the building of a viable political society and a leadership who have attempted to engage across the conflict rather than to exacerbate or confront in the conflict. And I wonder, as you look at the situation now, from your perspectives that you've had through the years, whether anything like strategic optimism helps you understand or look for directions which are possible in today's world.
Why don't you answer that, Herb, now, before we move on?
Well, I haven't, but I think you're absolutely right. I ought to be looking at that. I mean, that's what strategic optimism is about. You know, to look for all of the possibilities, essentially. And what you're pointing out, I mean, it's very interesting to me. I mean, because you're pointing out some positive, the role of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has generally been viewed as what shall we say, ineffectual, to say the least. And you're pointing out that there are some things to work with, and I think it's a great idea. I mean.
And before we move over here, would you like to say something about Paula's comment about the women and that cultural resource that we could use and mobilize?
Well, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with it. We have, as you know, I mean, over the years, I've had a number of experiences with organizing work, allowing to organize the organization of women's workshops, and I think there's, I don't want to overdo it, but I think there's a potential there. I think there are real cultural differences between the genders that make there's a kind of what shall I say, traditional role of men having to prove that they're the more powerful, whereas women, I think there is a cultural and historical heritage of accommodation, and I think that's a potential that we have not sufficiently mined.
Great, okay. Abby?
Hi, thanks for a great talk, Professor Kelman. My name is Abby Yano. My field is leadership development. I actually served in the Israeli army in the 1970s, and I'm now a peace activist that brings Palestinian and Israeli activists to this country. I think we do have the cultural resources and the civil society who are doing really incredible things that are changing perspectives, which are the combatants for peace, the Israeli and Palestinian activists working together, and the parent circle of bereaved families. And this business about Frontline is, these things happen in public, and so the public sees the conversations happening, which I think are transformational, not just for the Palestinians and Israelis, but the audience who listens to it. So I hosted the combatants here in Boston, and you could sense something the palpable energy in the audience listening to it. And I always thought there must be a way to capture that energy and do something. On the leadership development score, Bob Keegan in one of his books talks about you. You're looking around. He talks about you in reference to stages of adult development. And at the highest stage, at stage 5, which is self-transformational, it is the piece where the people in conflict, not only do they understand the perspective of the other, but in a previous stage, you would say, well, you're the source of my conflict, and if you would just go away, this conflict would be resolved. But stage 5 actually says, no. If you disappear, the conflict won't go away, and we recognize how you represent something internal to me. You represent a piece of me, and it's not going to help that you go away. So have you have you thought, I'm sure you've thought about this, how to help people sort of move to that stage of development?
Good luck with that one, Herb.
Well, I don't know, I haven't, I was looking at
Pam.
Pam here. You want to answer that?
Well, I don't think Bob Keegan's theory works at that stage for that job. I actually somehow don't think that. But I'm not sure. It's,
Pam.
oh, sorry. I really wish I could answer that properly. Jeff? Can you, at stage 5? I mean, could you, Madam, articulate?
Pam, speak into the,
Sorry. Could you possibly articulate how somebody, a Jew at stage 5, an Israeli at stage 5, has a need for Palestinians? What does that complete in the Israeli, which I
That's a brilliant question. I want
Okay.
to say.
Abby, wait a second, let her get the, Diane's getting her exercise.
That's a really brilliant question, which we might apply our collective thinking to, like, what is that about? I want to say when the combatants were here, it was very beautiful to see, and they exemplified stage 5. The Palestinian and Israeli, at the end of the night, it was like 9:30 after a presentation, and so the Palestinian they were joking around. The Palestinian got up and spoke as if he was the Israeli and starts telling the Israeli story. And then the Israeli gets up and starts speaking as if he was the Palestinian. It was absolutely brilliant. It was a perfect example of stage 5. So this question about what does it represent, I mean, I think we could come up with something. What does each represent for the other, right? So Keegan's model of stages of adult development, there are 5 stages. And so
Cognitive development,
cognitive, not moral.
yeah.
Yeah. So stage 3 is socialized. For adults, stage 3 is socialized. Stage 4 is self-authoring. And stage 5 is transformational. So stage 5, I mean, you might think that Gandhi and Mandela are stage 5, but also these people who achieve what I just described are also at stage 5, where they can truly take in the other's perspective, not just perspective, but speak from that perspective as if they totally get it. Yep.
Okay. Meenakshi? Down here, Diane?
I'm Meenakshi, and I just want to thank you for your inspiration, because inspired by you, I started the work with the civil society between Indian and Pakistani groups. And my question is bringing it back to your personal. How do you keep this strategic optimism alive in the midst of all of these changes that you've seen along the process? How do you keep that optimism alive?
Well, should I answer that?
Yes, please, because that's about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, it's, in a sense, the knowledge that you have to do this. You know, I mean, that's part of the strategy, basically. But also that I've had so many experiences over the years of seeing transformations in people. They may be small, they may be temporary, but moments. And it's many of these moments that one lives on, really. But I think I really believe that people can change. And I've had many, many illustrations of that. That's what keeps it alive.
Well, on that beautiful note, I think we will all join in thanking Herb for a lifetime of remarkable work and inspiration to all of us here. And I hope you continue for the next lifetime, actually.